delighted and honored to be here in Lahore and also to be moderating this hopefully wonderful panel. We have three fascinating writers, and the subject is Istanbul. So Istanbul is a fascinating city, a palimpsest, and has a very rich history and a very rich present. So these gentlemen are going to speak each from a different perspective, scholarly, writerly, also people who have lived and engaged with Istanbul, and we'll try to cover as much as possible in the short time. So I will just give a brief introduction. On my left, my dear friend Ghaith Abdul-Ahad, an Iraqi journalist, writer, and photographer, who writes for The Guardian, amongst other places, and soon he will have a book that will be coming out from Penguin about the cities that he's covered. And to my right, Mr. Kaya Genc from Istanbul, who's the author, translator, and journalist. A few of his books are Under the Shadow, Rage and Revolution in Modern Turkey, and an Istanbul anthology, travel writing through the centuries, and also there is a novel in the works that is forthcoming in English. And to my far right, Christopher de Bellaigue, whose most recent book is The Islamic Enlightenment, the Modern Struggle Between Faith and Reason, and also he's the author of Patriot of Persia, Muhammad Musaddaq, and the Tragic Anglo-American Coup. So we'll start with Mr. de Bellaigue, probably. Something about your own experience of Istanbul, and I think you said you wanted to speak of the architecture and...
Thank you very much for that introduction, and welcome to everyone here. It's lovely to see so much interest in Pakistan towards Istanbul. Towards Turkey, of course, the relationship between Pakistan and Turkey has been close for many years. But I think there are lots of similarities that could be teased out in terms of the two countries' recent history. So I think there's a great saliency to this discussion. And flying here this morning, taking off from Islamabad to come to Lahore, my eye was attracted by minarets in the distance, which I suddenly realized, I know that mosque. That's a Vedat Dalukai Mosque, Turkish architect who built the Faisal Mosque, which I think is the fourth biggest in the world, was certainly the biggest in the world at the time, and was very controversial because it didn't have a dome. And that was considered to be running counter to the orthodox way of building a mosque. But this extraordinary mosque in front of the mountains there, as you take off from Islamabad, is a great testament to the ingenuity and invention of Turkish architecture and the way that it has been received in Pakistan. The Istanbul that I first knew, well, it was, I think I could position myself as a foreign journalist who went to Turkey in the mid to late 1990s and gravitated to Istanbul at around the turn of the new millennium. I mean, I was living in Ankara, which was to my mind, a drab and uninteresting place, but it was the political capital, and I was constantly being drawn to Istanbul, this romance, the extraordinary position on the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn, this incredible accumulation of history, going back into antiquity, through Byzantium and into the Islamic period, after the conquest of the city in 1453 and up to the present day. An incredible accumulation, layer upon layer of history, and that drew me to the city, and eventually I got my dream and I bought a flat in Istanbul. And I think I'm part of that process that we call gentrification, because I was buying a flat in what had been the old European quarter of Istanbul, but since the Republic came into force, this part of Istanbul had been abandoned by middle class. No one wanted to live there, and so it was very much a poor part of town. And the block of flats where I bought my flat contained several Kurdish families. There were Roma families living down the street, and they used to hold very, very boisterous weddings just outside my door. It was a very unrefined, wonderful, spontaneous, warm place. And I, as a foreigner coming in, was part of that process of gentrification, because I was raising the prices, I was raising the value, and suddenly other people like me, Turks, foreigners, started coming into that area and buying property. And so you find this tension, which I think, you will correct me if I'm wrong, Kaya, this tension that I think lasts today, which is the tension between tearing down and building anew and preserving the old. And of course, I, as a typical Western European, want to preserve the old, and I think that the old is good and it should be preserved and it should look beautiful and it should be used. But there's a big strand of thought in Turkish life today which says, no, everything needs to be new. So I think that tension lies at the heart of modern Istanbul. One thing that I wanted to pick up, it slightly goes back to this question of the mosque, the Vedat al-Dukai mosque. Looking out this morning and seeing it, I was also brought back. I was a little bit scared on the flight, so I was trying to think about other things. I was brought back to the question of mosque building in Istanbul, which of course is hugely important. When the Ottomans arrived, the place was full of Byzantine churches, and they needed to stamp their authority and their aesthetic ideals. And they did so by beginning one of the most stupendous periods of mosque building in all of Islamic history. And the name to remember here is Mimar Sinan, who operated under Suleiman the Magnificent and changed the skyline. And those who followed him operated in the same idiom. It's a central design. You have a box, and then you have a large dome, and then around the dome are little half domes. And basically the finial at the top of the main dome leads the eye down to the half domes, and then that leads down to the buttresses. And you have this incredible solidity, but also a kind of weightlessness, because you see the way that the thrust of the dome is transported, is transferred in this very harmonious and very pragmatic way. In the 1990s, when I started living in Turkey, there was an explosion. I'll just be a couple more minutes. Tell me if I'm going on too long. There was an explosion in mosque building. Every single town and village in Turkey had to have a mosque. And restrictions were being lifted. The secular regime was loosening and it was getting weaker. And so everyone wanted a Sinan mosque. So it was Mimar Sinan, something like what you see in Istanbul. Of course, the quality was appalling. It was pure imitation. And these mosques had no aesthetic value, but they were important to people. And now what is happening in Istanbul is that we have a president who also likes Sinan mosques. And he is building a mosque that will rival even the Faisal Mosque in Islamabad in size and grandeur. It stands at the most visible point on the Bosphorus, overlooking the city. It will be higher. Its minarets will be taller than the tallest of the Mimar Sinan mosques. The new mosque of the President of the Turkish Republic will be higher and bigger and better than the mosques of the great classical architect. And the thing about this new mosque is that it is completely redundant. It has no artistic value. It is imitation. Its materials bear no relation to the organic materials that should be used in mosque building. There is no innovation, there is no spark of invention. And I'd just like to plant that idea that amid this city of extraordinary innovation and invention and artistic achievement, a powerful ruler is able to put something that has none of these qualities. And this, I think, is important, and I think it's very sad.
So I think next, Kaya, if you would like to respond, but also the problem with great and magnificent cities like Istanbul or Cairo or other cities is that the tendency to idealize and focus on it ends up marginalizing and other cities and other places. So perhaps you would like to elaborate on that as well as initiate a conversation or argument with our friend.
Well, what Christopher said about the conservatives, that how they are tearing down most of the city's old culture, points to an interesting duality in Turkish culture, because Turkey under Erdogan and his conservative party is very 20s, when the Turkish Republic was founded, Turkey said no to its older traditions, and Istanbul, that great imperial city, was replaced by Ankara, a city in central Anatolia, as Turkey's capital city. And so the modernizers just turned their backs on tradition. And interestingly, that's what Erdogan is doing, because Turkey has a great 20th century tradition of architecture, and Turkish modernism is an interesting phenomenon, and Turkish architects created their own aesthetics in Istanbul. But in order to be efficient and in order to deliver these buildings fast, he doesn't care much about these aesthetics. And in Taksim Square, for example, you will not know this because it just happened this year. There's a new mosque rising. It's going very, very quickly. And so I'm based in Istanbul, in a neighborhood called Taksim, where there was anti-government protests in 2013. And I've been living there all my life. But for 1 year, I lived in Amsterdam. So before I came here, I was in Amsterdam, and I was taking a walk through the city, and I realized how everything was basically the same. The building that I lived in, the cafe on the corner, the theater that I was going to, everything, all the signs and the typography and the aesthetics of the city remained the same. But I'm just 1 week away from Istanbul, and when I go back, I'm sure that something will have changed. And that's the pace of things in Istanbul, and that's the pace that Erdogan has brought to the city since 1994, when he was elected as Istanbul's mayor. And imitation, we don't like it as intellectuals, as those who appreciate good architecture and who we have this taste, but Erdogan is good at delivering transportation to the city, and that's, I think, that's what got him elected for many people, because there's a parallel aesthetic in Istanbul going on these days. The aesthetic of metros and subways and intercontinental trains, and just like in London, I can see that the new Istanbul aesthetic is actually growing from transportation, and people are becoming more interested in how Istanbul transportation works, and so that's one of the things that I find interesting, the lack of interest in, let's say, Islamic aesthetics and the aesthetics of mosques, for example, among the Turkish conservatives, but more interest shown in cities like London and New York. There, people are fascinated by the aesthetics of modernity and modernization. And if you go to Istanbul today, there is the old Hagia Sophia, there's the old Aya Ilini, all these places that you will feel obliged to visit because of the tourist books. But I think the more interesting phenomenon is how the transportation in the city has developed and how you can be a vendor in the city and how you can reach its outskirts and very distant parts of the city quite easily. And so the new Istanbul maybe doesn't turn us into appreciators of beautiful aesthetics, but it turns us into vendors of the city, the flaneurs, and so most of the people spend their time wandering the city because the city is so huge and it's becoming bigger and bigger with these new development projects. And I think that's what's interesting about Istanbul now, not the old, but what it's evolving into.
Thank you. And thank you. And there have been obviously tremendous and horrific changes in the region recently, and there have been mass movement of refugees, and there have been demographic changes, of course, all over. So I think Ghaith will give us a different perspective, not only of the writer and the journalist, but as someone for whom now Istanbul is a home.
Thank you. Like Christopher, I'm a journalist and I moved to Istanbul. But I didn't move to Istanbul to become a journalist in Turkey. I moved to Istanbul as I call myself a lifestyle refugee. I come from Iraq. Being a journalist in Iraq, or even living in Iraq, is not an option anymore. I moved to Beirut. Beirut is small, tiny. After a few years, you become claustrophobic. And then, meantime, you go to Istanbul because that's the horizon, the city. It sucks you in and you disappear. So I moved in 2011, and I live in a kind of like glorified refugee situation. If I leave Istanbul tomorrow, I don't know where to go. I mean, I have options. I can go different places. But Istanbul, you know this cliche about East and West, that every city on planet Earth wants to be this East and West, and Istanbul is this ultimate cliche of East and West. My father's family originally come from Arab-speaking parts of Turkey, and my grandfather fought the Turks, so I'm sure he's twisting in his grave knowing that I go back and live among the Turks. But I don't see Istanbul as one city, and so I've been living there for 7 years, and I think you captured that in your book in Rebel Land when you talk about moving to Istanbul. And so in 7 years I live in this neighborhood. Each city has its own neighborhood, and we live in these kind of like 2 square kilometers. Sometimes a journey will take me out, we'll take these ferries at 6 and 7, and you are amazed by the waves of people. And there's 17 million human beings in one city. The boats, the ferries that kind of give the people. And since 2011, as Sinan was saying, massive changes in the region, and Istanbul has successfully and unsuccessfully been trying to pose itself as the new capital of the region. Unwillingly, maybe millions of Arabs cross Turkey every month. Some tourists, some refugees, some live on the edge, some try to make changes. And then you see part of this old European neighborhood, and thanks to Christopher raising the rent prices, I live now and I pay much more rent than he paid for those Europeans. But the Arabs came, and the Arabs settled, and they opened restaurants and started competing with Turks in shawarma, in doner kebab, and all these things. So they created a second or a third wave of migration into the city. Many of them fled, many live in the outskirts, many live. So, you know, as Kaya was saying, you have the 90s, you have the changes, you have the Kurds coming to Istanbul, and you have the Arabs coming to Istanbul. And then the city itself, when I talk about Istanbul, I think of Cihangir, Taksim, different places, maybe Ayasofya Sofia, but the city is so much bigger, and each one of these different neighborhoods has its own character. I mean, I don't know about these different neighborhoods. I would love to tell me when they had revolutionaries taking over the outskirts of Istanbul, when they were fighting, when the left wing and the right wing, the Islamists, the whole thing. And as you walk in the city, it's all captured there, it all comes back to you, it all hits you. Apart from this beautiful center, I was an architect in a previous life, so it hurts me to see the ugly mosques being built. But as you move away from this beautiful center, you see these neighborhoods that you can see from Istanbul all the way to Armenian border. This repetitive concrete blocks coming on top of each other. And then within that landscape of concrete blocks, in each one of these neighborhoods, you have the coffee, you have the chaykhana, you have the tiny bar, if there or not, you have the different restaurants. So it feels like a series of cities coming together. And I wonder if for Istanbulians there is something called a unique sense of being part of Istanbul, as Christoph writes in his amazing books. Or is it now a more sense like a New York, a London, can be part of this neighborhood but not part of this neighborhood. So my question to you both is, do you feel there is a one sense of being Istanbul, or you're always, like me, a migrant from somewhere else, living in the city? You call it your home. I don't want to live in any other city ever in my life. But my home is somewhere else. I come from somewhere else. I bring my background from somewhere. So how do you see Istanbul? Is it a collection of cities, or is it one romantic city that we live in?
I think that's a really interesting question. And obviously, your own experience is leading you to ask that question, because it means something to you. What is this place that I'm living in? When I think of London, London is famous for not being planned. No one ever sat down. They wanted to after the Great Fire of London. There was a master plan. They were going to get rid of the old street plan and replace it with a grid, something much more close to a grid system. That didn't happen. And London's plan stayed the same. And London essentially grew in all sorts of directions, just incorporating villages. So each village was incorporated. The village centre stayed the same, and you can still see where the village centre was, the crossroads, the inn, the place where the gibbet hung, I mean, all the old facets of life in the 15th or 14th or 16th centuries are still there, but they've just been swallowed up by this ever-expanding city. And I feel that in some ways Istanbul is like that. A lot of Istanbul, a lot of those neighbourhoods end with the word köy, which means village. So they've just been incorporated. But then what you're talking about now is something quite different. It's greenfield construction. And do people, I don't know, I'd like to hear what Kaya thinks, but I do have one thing to say, is that these massive developments, privately funded, creating their own culture. So you have, they're called cités, and they have large blocks, maybe 10 or 12 blocks, each holding dozens of families. There's always a mosque, there's a large supermarket, there's a school nearby or two schools nearby. There are various transportation possibilities. And this creates a microculture, because within that cité, everyone is looking out for everyone else. So there's a great deal of solidarity. People help each other. But they also look out to see what other people are doing. So if you're a young girl and you want to have an independent life, and you're living in a cité, it's not going to work. Because not only are your parents there, but your parents' cousins are there, and everyone else who came from the same village, and everyone else of the extended community. So you're going to find it very difficult. And I remember once in one of these cités, which was, Erdogan's party is associated with the Sunni majority in Turkey. There is a large proto-Shia minority called the Alevis. I'm sure some of you know about the Alevis. So there was this, all the Sunni women are wearing their headscarves very tightly, you can spot them a mile off. and talking to a Sunni family in one of these cités, they introduced me to the daughter-in-law, who was also like this, but she'd come from an Alawi family, and she'd married into this Sunni family, and she had now completely adopted their mode of dress, their mode of talking, and she was going to the mosque in the same way that they did. I use this just as an example of the way that kind of micro-community can encourage or coerce people to behave the same way.
Yeah, that's what the great Turkish sociologist Sherif Mardin wrote about the mahalla baskısı, the pressure of the neighborhoods. That's the neighborhood protects you, it defines you, it limits you, but it also empowers you. So that kind of Ottoman tradition going to Turkish times, and what you were saying about the conflicts between the different parts of the city. Like, I've lived in, for example, the secular part of Istanbul called Nişantaşı, where Orhan Pamuk also comes from, and that's that part of your life that you live in that neighborhood, you characterize as my maybe white Turk years, and then that part of the city is seen as elitist, and the Turkish ruling classes live there, so it's very politically identified. But then you just take a 10-minute walk from there and you reach Cihangir or Taksim, and that's a very different story, a different neighborhood, which is politically very differently defined. And I think the differences between neighborhoods were most apparent during the coup attempt in 2016. Some parts of the Turkish military staged this coup against the Turkish president in July 2016. And the city, Istanbul, reacted very differently to what was going on that night. So in Cihangir, where I live, the streets were empty, people were in their rooms. You could see them typing stuff into their iPads or just like drinking and looking at the screens. But in the next neighborhood, Tophane, where Erdogan comes from, or Kasımpaşa, also a neighborhood very close to Cihangir, people were pouring onto the street and trying to take control of the situation with their cars and flags. And people living in my neighborhood were looking at them very peculiarly, like, oh, who are these people? What's going to happen? Why are they putting their lives in danger? Why are they going out and trying to fight these tanks? So I think those events make you see the frictions between neighborhoods in Istanbul more clearly. And in Üsküdar, for example, I don't know if you live there, but Çengelköy, Üsküdar, the Anatolian side of the city, there was a big uprising against the military coup. And I felt that because I was living in Cihangir during the coup, I behaved the way I did. But if I was living in Çengelköy or Üsküdar, I would behave differently. Because just like Sherif Mardin says, the neighborhood continues to define who I am and how I react to things. And that's a very Istanbul thing.
Can I add
Yeah,
one thing?
I want you guys to have a...
So what Claire said was true. Not only that night when the people called, so let's say Taksim, where usually where all coups and events take place, is the big square, is on a hill, and people came from Kasımpaşa to resist and push against the army. This was a massive scene, amazing scene, noble scene. People pushing against the military and then capturing the military. But then night after night, there were these demonstrations in Taksim to show solidarity with the government against the coup. The people who come from these lower neighborhoods, poorer neighborhoods, more religious neighborhoods, wouldn't go in a direct line to the Taksim, but would take a march into the so-called secular neighborhood, so they go around the Lata and something. And it's almost with their chants and the flags, you almost feel this kind of a victorious march, we're not invading you, but we're seeing you we are there, we're showing you our presence. And I put that in relation, because again, all the people sitting in these, secular, middle-class neighborhood, we just like look at these marchers through the windows of the restaurants and what are they doing and the chances for Mahal Barakas. So I thought that dilemma was very interesting, and it again reminded me of the things that I read about Istanbul in the 70s and how much.
So someone from my building threw eggs to these marches, and then the guy who runs the apartment was like, "You're going to give our apartment a bad name. You should stop throwing eggs." But they didn't stop. They were like they wanted to express themselves.
What you say, it takes you straight back to an episode in British history, which is in Northern Ireland. The idea of marching for both the Protestant and the Catholic groups was an absolute expression of ownership and also an invasion tactic. You invade, so the Orange marches every year, now much less so, but they used to be hugely controversial, and there would always be violence, because you are taking your banners and your just the way you look, and you are invading someone else's territory, so you're going through. So it's exactly the same thing, and I can just imagine the area he's describing is the most tourist-friendly. It's the place where all the bars are. The business there all survives on tourist money, and the tourists like to have a drink. So the idea of these people marching through is, it's almost like Mehmet II invading Istanbul in 1453 for the first time, and the Byzantines are kicked out, and he goes to the Galata Tower built by the Genoese, and this is where he stakes his claim. This is now my city.
But the music they were playing is this old Ottoman marches, the military thing on their loudspeakers or something. So not only the religious chants, which could be interpreted in different ways, but that old martial Ottoman music with its significance, and as you said, started talking about putting your stamp on a city. I was going to say this to the end, but I have this feeling, and I don't know if you agree with me or not, because it's a very large city. It's rarely you see a city in the world that sits on 3 seas. I mean, without the seas in Istanbul, imagine 17 million people living in this concrete jungle. It would be horrible. However, the seas give it opening, allow it to exist. So I think it's a city that's always alive. I mean, our sense of horror and the atrocities, architectural atrocities committed now. Imagine if you're a Greek Byzantine architect living in 1454, and you see all these mosques built by the people coming from the Balkans. I mean, you'd be horrified too. However, so I wonder if in 10 years' time we will see this city taking a new shape, or it will be able to absorb the ugliness and it will just hide it behind its facade. Because, I mean, the atrocities committed in the 60s and 70s, and I mean kind of architectural atrocities, are unparalleled. So, I don't know.
Well, I think it's very interesting that we haven't. I mean, you mentioned Orhan Pamuk once. 10 years ago, we've been having this discussion. Orhan Pamuk and his book Istanbul, and his books about Istanbul, and his constant references to Istanbul, the inspiration he drew from the city, would be front and center of all our discussions. And he used to walk around the city, and he derived his inspiration from these long walks that he would take. But now it sounds as though you're going to get on a metro, you're going to get on a bus, you're going to get on a funicular railway. It's all about different forms of transportation now. And obviously you go much further in a much quicker time. And so everything is everything is contracted and yet at the same time expanded. And I think it's very interesting that we haven't really brought Pamuk into the conversation. I think it's very significant.
I came to Istanbul because of Pamuk. I read My Name is Red, and I loved it, and I fell in love with the city, and I had to go to Istanbul and see it, and then Black Book and everything. So my experience through the city came through Orhan Pamuk. I mean, whatever people say about the books, but he is the ultimate novelist who can capture the soul of the city through all his characters, as you said before. So
his penultimate book, Strangers in My Mind, was about those distant neighborhoods that we were discussing. And I think he wanted to show that he's still mapping out Istanbul. He's still aware where Istanbul is growing into, and all these new neighborhoods and all these new people moving to these neighborhoods. But Istanbul has always been a messy city. It's always been very chaotic, and so the Republicans in the 1920s, they decided to move the capital to Ankara because they wanted to build a new city that's more built on rational principles, architecturally new principles, and that would reflect the aesthetics of a new nation, the Turkish.
Does that ring any bells in Pakistan?
So the secular nation's new capital would be built on all these kind of new principles. So Istanbul was a bit forgotten throughout 1920s and 30s, and the Germans were very inspired by this sudden shift in the center of a culture, and they were viewing Berlin in the same way that the Kemalists were viewing Istanbul as a messy city with degenerate city, where prostitution, like multilingualistic city, like lots of different religions, cultures, and the dominant nation is not actually dominant in Istanbul. The city of Armenians and Jews and the Sunni Muslims were minority. And so they decided to move the city to Munich. So and that's the Kemalist attack against Istanbul inspired Nazis in their attack against the degeneration of Berlin. And so there are also interesting parallels. When I read Christopher Isherwood, for example, the Berlin novels, I'm reminded of Istanbul in those times and the kind of feeling of decay and how the locals might be feeling back then, the feeling of being left behind. And Pamuk is very good at capturing that. But maybe Istanbul has changed. Its status has changed so dramatically that that kind of being left behind is no longer there.
I mean, it's important to remember that for most Westerners in the 1970s, when you said the word Istanbul, it meant one thing: Midnight Express. Who's seen Midnight Express today? It doesn't make you want to go to Istanbul, does it? I mean, it's about a guy who's smuggling drugs. He gets put in jail in Istanbul, suffers appalling indignities and humiliations, and is sort of lost from view. It's a nightmare story. And if I were working in the Istanbul Bureau of Tourism Development and I saw that film, then you just think, oh God, how are we going to get over this? I mean, and it lasted for literally 15 years. We would just say Midnight Express, until Erdogan, and he became mayor, and suddenly Istanbul was now the centre of politics because he was becoming mayor. And Kaya's heard this story, but I'll tell it again because no one else has. When I was a journalist in the late 1990s in Turkey, I managed to get an interview with Erdogan, who was then the mayor of Istanbul. And he'd started restoring some of the old Ottoman buildings, particularly in the parks. And so there was a kiosk that he'd restored. He'd done it very well. It was very beautifully restored. But it was controversial, and the secularists made the point, they're going to be selling teas and coffees, but they won't sell alcohol. And so that they were niggling at him for the small offence that he'd committed and completely missing the greater good, which was that he'd taken this crumbling building and he'd saved it and he'd given it value. And there I was with this guy that people didn't know. Was he an Islamist? Was he trying to bring in the Sharia by the back door? And he gave me these wonderful early strawberries. It must have been April. And the spring sun was hitting the terrace where we were sitting, looking down on the Bosphorus. And I was completely seduced. I ate the strawberries, I wrote a wonderful profile, this guy, there was nothing to worry about, maybe he's a really civilized guy.
The strawberries are great.
The strawberries are wonderful. It shows how easily it is to dupe a young journalist who just who's happy to be duped.
But Midnight Express is forgotten now, and we have the Murder on the Orient Express, and I've been watching it on the plane. And that's the kind of Istanbul that's being promoted nowadays. We're going to have a great train ride, we're going to see all these interesting people, locals, and the prisons. They don't make films about Turkish prisons anymore. Maybe they should.
Yeah, but where's that one prison which they turned into a Four Seasons hotel? So an Ottoman prison, very fine, substantial building. Four Seasons bought it, and when they opened it, they found this poor leftist prisoner who'd been there in the 70s. And they said, do you want to come back and stay a night at the Four Seasons? So they brought him back and interviewed him, and he said, it's much better than I remember.
I mean, so all of you spoke wonderfully, but in a way we see that there are, under this rubric of the unified Istanbul, there's a lot of tensions and there are a lot of pockets. So what I wanted to ask, maybe it's important to think of, is that the politics of Turkey in the region and the rising sectarianism and exacerbation of ethnic identities and the disintegration of national identities in neighboring countries and the politics of the regime itself, what kind of effect will they have on these tensions, which until now are in a way manageable and hopefully they remain manageable, but what kind of effect the complicated and toxic politics in the region are going to have on these relationships in Istanbul, which could be a microcosm for other parts?
I think I should defer. I think Ghaith should answer this one, because I don't live in Istanbul anymore, so I'm not on the ground.
I mean, one of the things we didn't talk about now today is Gizibak, and I think if Istanbul ever managed to come united in one incident, so we have a decisiveness of the coup, politics, the regime. Gizibak was something phenomenal, and I speak as a journalist who's been covering conflict for 15 years. That was a very unique experience. Yes, of course, all of them were against the government, but that decline that now we can draw in Turkey between so-called Islamists and non-secular. And Gizibak was more blurred, so you see football hooligans, leftists, Islamists, Kurds, LGBT, all coming together, turning the streets of the city, the heart of the tourist neighborhood, into these massive barricades that kind of bring these images of Paris from 68 and Budapest and something. And that was an experience of the city when, the riots, every evening, the kids would find these, I think Northern Ireland would be very happy to come to visit that time, because you see the Molotovs burning the furniture, fire, tear gas, police, and in the morning come these municipal workers in their green vests, and they clean the city. I mean, the pavement still smells of tear gas, but you don't see it. You know there was something, but you don't see it. That is an amazing scene of a city, coming together, fighting together, and then the city itself trying to clean it and bring it back. So that was one of the very unique experiences of Istanbul.
But now it's changed dramatically, of course. So there's a state of emergency declared after the coup attempt. And so we don't we don't not only see something like Gezi, but we see no demonstration of street, because even the tiniest demonstration will get you into trouble. And so there is a strange calm and silence in the city. And because of Turkey's Syria operations, the olive branch operations, Turkey is in a proxy war with the US since the past 2 months. And it's interesting to see how people cannot talk about this, because if you want to protest, it's not a good idea. But some people fervently support the operation, some are against it, but in the public there's this silence. It's interesting. And when I take the metro, I always think that, so we are at war, and no one is talking about it. It's interesting. And how will this be articulated?
Well, a few years ago, people would demonstrate and fight in the streets over a public space, a park. Now the country is in a state of war, fighting an ethnic group which is represented by 20% of the Turks. And there is not a single, well, there was one single demonstration, because there is so much fear.
Just to Sinan's question about the sort of regional ramifications, I think it's interesting. It's worth emphasising the point that Ghaith, in some way, you embody. The Turks received, I don't know how many Syrians.
3 million.
And how many are in Istanbul?
I mean, I don't know the number, but so many Arabs in Istanbul that you start seeing signs in Arabic, food bookshops, which the Turks don't like. I mean, not necessarily they like it, but so many Arabs come refugees or visitors or studying that they actually managed to put.
They've sort of set down roots, and if you wanted to do a comparison, I'm sure the comparison with Afghan refugees in Pakistan would be something similar. An extraordinary displacement of human beings received relatively smoothly is extraordinary for me as a Western European, because it brings down governments, it causes Brexit, it causes all sorts of panics in Western Europe, and in Istanbul, in Turkey, it's happened not without problems, but it's happened relatively smoothly.
But see, these problems you talk about, and I don't want to become this kind of all happy things, but even the problems. I mean, imagine 3 million different ethnic groups that you've already had a troubled relationship with. They don't speak your language. They come, they settle, they start changing the fabric. So there are these kind of friction points. However, it's insignificant compared to, I mean, imagine 3 million Arabs descending on London tomorrow.
So is it working because of the Muslim solidarity?
No, I think because it's the city, and I think, I'm sure Kyle would agree with me, Turks are very nice. And I think this, yeah, seriously, I mean, so a similar amount of Syrians went to Lebanon. The race, and everyone speaks Arabic, the accent is different. The racism that Syrians suffer in Lebanon is horrible compared to, let alone the Syrians going to Iraq. We put them in refugee camps in the desert. Now, there are frictions. Turks are grumbling. People complain, oh, look at those Arabs, I've heard it, I've seen it. But it is insignificant. I don't know why, personally I don't know why, I mean, Kaya would answer me why. Is it because Istanbul is big? But not all of them went to Istanbul. Is it because of the Islamic solidarity? 50% of the nation is accepting them. For whatever reason, Turkey dealt with the migrant crisis, the refugee crisis. Again, I'm not defending, I'm just saying relatively compared to the way other Arab nations dealt with the Arab crisis, the Turks did very, very well.
Could it be partly this new image of some kind of, not a neo-Ottoman, but that with Turkey's rising importance geopolitically, that it is the country that can actually embrace, or is willing and has the capacity to manage and embrace, added to it the shared cultural horizon that exists.
I would answer this question, but I would say that we can talk about neo-Ottomanism for hours, but for a guy who has a kebab shop in Taqsim and he sees an Arab competing with him and taking his life, I'm sure he doesn't give neo-Ottomanism. So why is that guy not taking bricks and smashing the Arab shop? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we have the situation that's opposite most Islamic books, Ex-Quest, where there's this scenario where all the immigrants, come to this Western city and there's chaos reigns. And in Turkey, just the opposite, because people are like, oh, you came back to us. It's like, you were away, now you're back, because we were united and we were divided by these Western powers, and those maps were artificial and those politics were artificial, and now we are united and we found each other again, and there's this sense of welcome back attitude towards Muslims.
All right, so maybe we'll open it to questions from the audience, to our panelists. Yes? Is there a mic?
I just hope that if I'm audible enough.
The microphone is on its way.
Thank you for that wonderful session on Istanbul. I had the privilege of performing at my home for a year while I did my undergraduate in Istanbul. And one thing that I noticed there, my period coincided with Erdogan's re-election campaign for Sen Beni of Türkiye Var and then the Turkish coup. And during that time, I saw this dichotomy between liberalization and Islamization emerge, and a greater divide between who I am and who somebody else was. And I felt that there was a divide between the younger generation and the older generation that became even more prominent in Istanbul during this time. And I would like the perspective of all four panelists on this as to where this divide is headed and what the root cause of this divide has been.
So the divides between the generations after Erdogan's rise to power. There was this study about Turkish private lives and sexualities, and it turned out that Turkey was becoming more secular under Erdogan. In terms of people were less interested in the traditional Islamic ways of socializing. But the city has come to the fore now, and the city structures that Erdogan is building are forcing people, the young, maybe the daughters and sons of conservative families, to be more secular, because in shopping malls, in all these places whose architecture we don't like, people are producing this new forms of socializing. And no wonder that Twitter and Facebook have perhaps the biggest user bases in Turkey. When you look at Europe, the numbers, Turkey has this huge interest in secular ways of socializing, and so it's difficult to make a division between the secularists and the Islamists in that, because at the end of the day, Facebook reigns.
Okay, there was a question here in the front, I think.
I have two quick questions. One, when you think of Istanbul, you think of, as you pointed out, Mimar Sinan, defining the skyline. And having taught him, he was probably the greatest architect the world has produced. He has over 400 monuments, just not great mosques, but caravanserais and public baths and kiosks and madrasas and orphanages, you name it, and he's done it. Why is it, especially the question is addressed to you as an architect, that is so little known, not only in the West, but even across the Islamic world. I mean, I had a class of masters on history of Islamic and Muslim architecture, and not one student knew his name. The second question is that you talked about architecture in Turkey being imitative. Is that a state policy, or is that a failure of the architects to be creative?
Can I answer? Yeah. So I will answer the second question first. I think it's not a state policy. It's the problem of architects. The lack of. I'm sorry, I'm not condemning Turkish architecture, but if you see it on a general scale, if you compare the urban concrete centers, buildings being built in Turkey and being built in Beirut today, you see more attempts. It's all concrete, it's all building. You see more attempts in Beirut to create balconies, to create variation, to bring green. While in Turkey, there is this monolithic attempt to repeat these concrete. Even the new ones are not nice. So I don't think it's the state's policy. It's a lack of architecture. I mean, I'm sure the new mosque is really being built now. I'm sure they wanted to repeat the same proportions in the old one. However, it's a fake cardboard imitation you see across the water. So I think it's a failure in the aesthetics of young architects. To go back to your first question, I, as an architect, didn't know about Sinan until I moved to Turkey as a writer. And then when I first moved, I thought it's this mosque, the second mosque, and then you see the Wuzu place, you see the Caravanserai. So he's an amazing character. And also he took from Hagia Sophia and he developed his own style, and he himself was a son of a migrant. We come from the Balkans, I think. So all these things being built together create this amazing kind of architect that I would love to read a book about him in this book.
There's one thing that I can add to this, which is if you go to Ankara, you go to the Parliament building at Ankara, you'll see an extraordinary mosque that was built in the 1980s by a father and son team called Behruz and Can Çinici. And it was built by secularists who realized they had to have a mosque. So it doesn't look anything like a mosque. The Çinicis said, we're not going to have a minaret. They said, you've got to have a minaret. You don't have a minaret, it's not a mosque. So they planted a cypress tree. Most beautiful solution. If you see it, it looks more like a ziggurat than a mosque, but it's extraordinarily restful, peaceful, wonderful building. When they attacked the Turkish Parliament building 2 years ago in the coup, an associated little kiosk or little building associated with the mosque was damaged. And there is now a fear that they will use the damage that building sustained to declare the mosque damaged and unfit for purpose and get rid of it and put up another imitative thing. This mosque, by the way, won the Aga Khan Prize for Architecture in 1986. It must be saved.
I just wanted to say about the illusion of Sinan, because this is something that I'm very interested in, not because of my name, but this is in a way the problem of the Eurocentricity of modern knowledge in a way, and we see it everywhere, in architecture, in world literature, and because so much of the notion of Western modernity that so many folks in non-European countries internalize is that the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe and was something, it was relegated to the pre-modern and the non-Western and so on and so forth. Of course, it's completely incorrect, but that's why so many other examples from my field of Arabic literature, or so many important names, whether in philosophy or in architecture, that were integral to world knowledge today, like Ibn Rushd, Averroes, are not there. So at Columbia University in New York, around the library, they have the names of all the great philosophers the world has produced. And of course, it's Aristotle, Plato, and everyone else. But none of the great philosophers who worked and wrote on this continent and Africa and elsewhere and so on and so forth. So unfortunately, this illusion continues that we have to problematize. But thank you for the wonderful panelists and for your patience, and that's it.